This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to come here. And as I said, it's because of basically Ben Hayes' suggestion that people could look at what we're doing. So this really, I don't know why we've got two screens anyway. That'll confuse me even more, but that's all right. I'm going to talk about survey-based methods in the design of breeding programs and how we use them and how we've come to use them in mostly in animal breeding, but in plant breeding as well. So I'm going to give you a description briefly about what AbacusBio is, talk a little about why we've done why we got involved in survey-based methods, talk about how we go from breeding objective to selection indexes using this information we get, and a little bit of perspective on why we engage with users in this way and what's different about it, how we approach the whole thing, and we use a combination of demographic surveys and 1,000 minds. A couple of applications, one's in pasture plants and one's a dairy application, and then some of the principles of that, and then how they might apply in next-gen cassava. And our connection with next-gen cassava is Ariti Balogun, who's from Nigeria, is doing a PhD at the University of Otago, but she's actually located in AbacusBio offices in Dunedin, in our office in Dunedin. And her PhD's got this goes into this survey stuff and associated with nutrition and of people. Okay, so what's AbacusBio? Okay, our strap line is bridging science and business. We exist to basically to get science out from lab type stuff, and we started it nearly 18 years ago because we actually saw a gap where the science was getting more complex, especially with genomics coming in and all the DNA-based technologies coming in, especially in animal breeding, and it was getting harder and harder to get it into how that will be put into applications in practical applications. And our mission is to make a difference to food production internationally using science and technology. Okay, how do we do this? Our core capability is actually in genetic improvement, and that's where we've got a lot of people who have trained in livestock, virtually always livestock breeding, and in with a very strong, a lot of them too, with a very strong component of mathematics and statistics. In order to keep our feet on the ground, we have people working in farm systems and increasingly in environmental applications, and then our core in genetics has led us into a lot more technology, data analytics, and a lot more economic analysis, strategic analysis, and that's probably what I do most of now is looking at biological economic scenarios for customers. Okay, that's what we do. Our global footprint, we operate out of New Zealand. We've got 2 offices in New Zealand, one in Dunedin in the south, right down here, there, and one in Rotorua, which is in the middle of North Island, and then in Edinburgh, which is up there. And the office in the North Island in Rotorua is where we do have our plantation forestry group, who have just actually merged with us. Actually, they were a separate company and have just merged with us a few weeks ago. And then the office in Edinburgh is basically the same sort of things, and we interact very strongly with those 2 groups. We operate in a number of different countries. You'll see we've just done a major project in the US. So we've just done a major project in the US with American Angus, and we're doing another one in American Angus cattle, and we're just doing another project in Canada as well. And we've got projects in Ethiopia in small ruminants, and we've got projects in Saudi Arabia in development, ruminants and breeding, and in agricultural development with livestock. Okay, what do we do? These are the sort of species. AbacusBio, we're known internationally for what we do in breeding program design and data and financial analysis associated with a lot of those things. So we work in sheep, we work in beef cattle, we work in dairy cattle, we work in salmon, honeybees more recently, and deer, farm deer, and then in plantation forestry. So these are the areas we work in. The background to our interest in this, the origin of our interest in this is that we were involved in development of breeding objectives and selection tools in animal breeding. And those of you who come out of especially out of an animal breeding background, know that the breeding objective in animal breeding is a critical facet in the design of the breeding program. It's commonly built on bioeconomic models of the enterprise, if that makes sense. So it's driven off understanding an enterprise like a farm and then saying, okay, what would influence, where does the revenue come from, where does the money get spent? And the breeding objective is a profit function. It's a marginal change in profit is a function of a change in the revenue and a change in the costs. It's pretty basic stuff. And then, but bioeconomic models can be deficient in accounting for some user requirements. And these are traits that are difficult to define in economic terms, or where users may regard them as more important. There's a really good examples of this is in disease in animals. Disease issues are usually much bigger issues for farmers than they ever are in terms of their economic cost. And we've got a number of situations where we've got evidence of that now. So thinking about other ways to get at the truth. And when people buying animals, they don't always buy just on economic things. They buy on other things. They might, for example, buy on something they believe might be associated with heat resistance or something like that. And these things are quite hard to turn into, to incorporate into bioeconomic models. And these are situations where users regard a trait as more important than any financial model might indicate. I've got some examples of that later. So I'll give you an example in sheep, pretty straightforward one. It's fundamentally the revenue from sheep comes from selling lamb meat, surplus animals, and from wool, and the costs come from animal health, labour, and feed. So you can imagine in a sheep business, they're your revenue lines and they're your cost lines. So you can create a bioeconomic model for that. However, when you come to talk to farmers, you find that two issues, animal health and labour, are far more important to them than the economic cost. Really good example in labour is that if you're running a few thousand sheep and you've got an increase in labour requirement for some reason, it might be because of disease issues or it might be just because of the nature of your animals, and you have to increase by a labour unit, that's a very big change in costs. Has a major influence in the dairy industry in New Zealand in terms of the number of cows that are milked, because New Zealand runs a pastoral cattle system. So the number of cows that are milked actually governs the size of herds. So if you have to increase the number of animals, if you have to add a labour unit, that's a major decision-making issue. So animal health's another one where there's big issues around where the cost of animal health might be something, but animal health costs often have a spasmodic component, a stochastic component, and that's a real problem for farmers in terms of how to manage. So resistance to disease is often a very big trait of importance. So why did we get into this? Well, we had a bit of a history in AbacusBio where Hannah Marie Nielsen came and worked for us for about a year, and Peter Amer is one of our guys, and they came up with an approach to derive economic weights in breeding objectives using profile. And they published that paper in 2007 in Animal. But one of their dilemmas was that there was a scarcity of software packages to generate the design. And then I was at a workshop thing one day and I heard Paul Hansen talk, and he just lived just down the road, and he had developed 1,000 Minds. He and Franz Ombler had developed a tool called 1,000 Minds, which they published, and it was originally devised for prioritizing surgery in the health scheme. So it's now used this expert opinion is now used to prioritize, I think, about 16 different types of surgery in the New Zealand health scheme. It fundamentally generates a preference-based, points-based system. And interestingly, 2 years ago, it was used to prioritize the antibiotic-resistant bacteria issues for the World Health Organization. So Paul Hansen's a co-author on this paper, and they flew him into Geneva, to in fact work through 1,000 Minds with a group of experts they had there to work out, to prioritize the particular ones that are particular pathogens of concern in terms of antibiotic resistance. So it's developed quite a big life of its own, and it's well available on the website. It's used now in vast numbers of different applications. its value proposition really is that enables you to, in fact, do questionnaires relatively economically and relatively simple by simply enabling what are really practical alternative choices. That's how it works. Okay. So a bit of background here as to how we get from the breeding objective to an index. So you'll hear in some of this talk, I'll be talking about both development of the breeding objective and the selection index. We've used it for both, developing the breeding objective, which I said before is a profit function, and then the selection index is how you get traits and put them into a breeding program, into an actual breeding program. So what we do, development of a selection index, you simply take the breeding objective. You may all know this, I don't know what the backgrounds are at all, but we'll take it. You define recordable, heritable traits that drive the outcome delivery of the breeding objective. You derive the economic values for the change in each trait, and then you create a selection index. Very straightforward approach. Take you through the steps. Let's look at better sheep. Two things in sheep. Twins are very, very good, and animals that grow fast are good. So what's the margin, the breeding objective in sheep? The marginal change in profit, change in the revenue minus the change in costs. And the revenue, I said before, comes from lamb meat, surplus and cull animals, and from wool. And the costs come from animal health, labour, etc. Now, in terms of revenue in a sheep business, it's actually quite easy to quantify. It's different. It's not always the case. In a number of cases, it absolutely isn't. So the 1,000 minds approach can work both in revenue and in cost. But in sheep, it's relatively easy to get the revenue side right. It's the cost side which is complex. So the revenue side, numbers of lambs born or weaned, the growth rate to slaughter or the weight at slaughter, and their meat quality traits. These are all things that influence the revenue that a farmer will get from a sheep flock. On the cost side, labour and health treatments and feed costs, and perhaps reproduction costs. So they're the heritable traits that are used in the selection index, and they all, and as you see, they come from the revenue and the costs. They come from the breeding objective. So you can look at the numbers of lambs born, what an extra lamb born actually means to a ewe, what it means in terms of the growth rate, what it means in terms of the costs, all those sort of things. And then the economic values, and we do a lot of work on deriving economic values out of these bioeconomic models, they're expressed per unit change in the trait. And they assume, of course, that all other things are held constant at the time. And there's a lot of work on bioeconomic models and this sort of stuff. And Peter Raymer, one of our guys who was in there at the start, published a lot of work in terms of development of breeding objectives. So but then we go from the breeding objective to the selection, from the economic values to the selection index. And here's a selection index. Just says the economic value of numbers of lambs weaned by the change in numbers of lambs weaned, plus that of carcass weight, plus by the change in carcass weight, and plus that in disease resistance, multiplied by disease resistance. And one of the really important things is when you're doing these things is to get the sign right. So disease resistance may be you have to be very focused on getting the sign right. And some of the times the signs are not always as intuitive as they look. A really good example is intercalving interval in beef and dairy cows. Getting the sign right in that one is really it can be quite complicated logic. So you've got to be very careful. So why talk to users? Why bother? As I said before, economic models can be deficient in meeting user needs. And the reason is because you can't get to the nuances of how people make decisions. And that may be regional, it may be associated with different regions, it may be associated with where their markets are, they do different products. There's different things like that. And so the objective for the index may be different depending on where you are. And the other thing is that understand better what farmers really want to be improved beyond the obvious economic traits. Now, one of the examples we've used, one of the situations where we have used 1,000 minds, not in the breeding program design, but in a communication with farmers and in designing an industry disease control scheme, has been with a disease called Johne's disease, Mycobacterium paratuberculosis johneii, and it was a particular problem in the New Zealand farm deer industry. It came in and it caused some have a particular problem, and then the industry put together their own control scheme. part of the communication about that was, how do you talk to farmers about the problem? How do you talk to farmers about managing it? How do you get them involved? And the thing there was that we did 1,000 mines, and we found that the farmer view of the cost of the disease was around twice or slightly more than twice the actual economic cost of the disease to them. So in other words, it had an impact on how they behaved, had impact on what they could do, their flexibility, a whole lot of things like that. So that's a really good example. And why do breeders want it? Breeders want better uptake, and they want better sales. And they also want to improve their long-term engagement with their customers to grow their business. That's why it's of interest. So what's different about talking to users or interested partners? Now, I'm talking about users in the broadest sense here. It may be farmers as users. It may be processors as users who buy product. It may be anything. But it changes the traditional economic approach and introduces some new tools for plant and animal breeders. It enables you to quantify the views of farmers and other partners to enable you to develop new approaches to breeding that might actually be better for communication with the people that are actually buying your product, or buying the breed, or buying the new animal, or the new plant, or whatever. It recognizes that people's views go beyond dollars. What that enables them to do can actually be a key part which may not be fully accounted for in the economic model. And it provides insights into whether there are subgroups of farmers or subgroups of people, and what might drive this, and also present opportunities for breeding companies. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. So how do we do it? And in fact, the principles of how we do it are here. So fundamentally, we do it through an online survey, and we've used that in Nigeria. Riki is using that with an interview-based approach. Can be done with that. In Ireland, we use an interview-based approach for people present. We use a number of different ways. But we do, over time, we've introduced a demographic survey into the thing. And demographics, not 1,000 mines, but we link the demographic survey with the 1,000 mine survey. We're just about to launch one for honeybees, for breeders of honeybees and breeders that breed queen bees, and the users of honeybees for either honey or pollination. And one of the key things there is to understand what groups we're working with. Are we working with people who are interested in pollination? Are we interested in working with groups that are interested in honey? Are we interested in working with those that are in very high value honey, or those that are in standard honey? Important thing. And the respondents' trait preferences, either farmer or other, and their perception of their value of change in the trait. And that's what we use 1,000 mines for. Our output are choice patterns or preferred product profiles and dollar equivalents for traits. We don't always do dollar equivalents. Sometimes we're just happy with the preference profile. It depends on the trait, on the organization we're working with. And we can cluster users into typologies, which means, and I'll give you an example of that for an Australian dairy industry in a minute thing. But in some of the what we've done in plant breeders, we found that there was a difference between breeders and everybody else in terms of the importance of seeding. You know, seed's hellish important for breeders because they have to produce seed, but it's not what farmers want, because it messes up with quality. So late flowering in ryegrass is wonderful for farmers, but terrible for breeders, because you may miss your ryegrass crop. So those sort of complexities are important. So I'll go on now and talk about the demographic survey. Here's the demographic survey. Things that we look at. This is one, I think, from. Oh, this is a project we've just done in Poland with dairy cattle in Poland, which is why it's in a language which I can't read. And it was incorporate factors that might influence other people's trait priorities, like farm size, their location, what they thought about this quantitative breeding versus the traditional breeding of looking at animals that they might think. What services they had available, how old they were, or anything else that might influence their preferences for traits. Now I'll talk a little bit about what we do with 1,000 mines, just at this high level, before I go on to some case studies. And this is looking at the trait preferences. So the trait preferences have to be in readily known terms, and it's critical to get the direction of the trait right. What's the better choice? I'll come back and talk about things in a minute. This is a really nice example of whether there is no better choice. This is, you can either have a cheaper coffee or you can have a stronger coffee, right? And so fundamentally it contrasts a much cheaper coffee with a weaker coffee. And in fact, this is entirely a preference-based approach. There is nothing here. You cannot tell me that anybody knows which is the better. It's a highly individual approach. So in such a situation where we're trying to make this quantitative, we're dealing with one at the moment in our honeybee thing, where we're really trying to puzzle our way through where we've got a trait which may well depend entirely on the demographic as to whether that's a good trait or a bad trait, depending which is the most preferred trait. So we may well run a separate survey. We're not sure yet how we'll do it. May well run a separate survey where they're dealt with separately first, and then we categorize our groups and then administer the right survey to them. We're not sure yet how we're going to do it, but we're dealing there with a lot of respondents, so we're not sure how we're going to do it. So now defining the trade-offs. This is where most of the time comes in developing Thousand Minds. I have to say, administering the survey and analysing the data is easy compared with this bit. This is the bit where we spend a lot of time. This is actually developing the questionnaire, developing the survey. Really, what we spend a lot of time on it, and we use experienced people, and we test the survey with them. We try and get rid of ambiguities with the questions. We make the questions very simple, and we're getting more and more focused on making the comparisons incredibly simple. You'll see some of the early ones we've done are not that simple. It depends to who you're talking to. If you're talking to a very experienced group, it's less of an issue. So define the trade-offs. So we use experienced practitioners, we run pilots, we assess the consistency of response for individuals in time. So we may run the same survey with the same individuals over 3 days, over a week, for argument's sake, and just look at whether they're consistent. If they're not consistent, you start looking at how you've worded the questions. So it's quite iterative. And we spend a lot of time getting this right. This is one we've just done. This is the American Angus one. Well, I think we had 1,500 farmers and people in the industry involved in this one. So it's an online, phone, one-on-one, group meeting, lots of different ways. So now, in terms of what you get, in terms of output, as I said before, this is some of the outputs, just looking at the outputs, the choice patterns, the preferred product profile, and the equivalents, and the dollar equivalents for traits, and then clustering of users. So here's sort of one, I think this looks like the stuff we got out of the Australian dairy one. We got them up with a trait ranking. We compare preferences to valuation, so we can put economic data on them. And then we did the group analysis. We came up with a priori groups where we actually thought there might be something. For example, people that had more black and white cattle versus other cattle. We used PCA and cluster analysis to form typologies. And then we looked at what features of the demographic may be distinguishable between typologies. In the case of the Australian dairy, that wasn't there weren't any demographic components, but there were definitely groups of typologies that came up that changed the way that people marketed their products. What have we used it for? The first project we really did was looking at sheep in Ireland. We did that in about 2007, 8, 9. Then we did pasture plants. Kevin Smith now at University of Melbourne, and I did a project in grasses and legumes. We've done dairy cattle in Australia, New Zealand. I'll talk about the dairy cattle one. Angus cattle in the US and now in Canada. Just starting a honeybees one in New Zealand. And as you know, we've got the cassava one in Nigeria and Uganda, and sweet potato with EIB in Uganda as well. And we've looked at in farmer priorities in diseases and understanding other things. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 case studies which goes through. The first is selection index development in the dairy industry, and the second is valuing difficult traits in ryegrass breeding. Australian dairy industry. Why? What traits why we did it? Why the Australian DataGene, which is the Australian Dairy Herd Improvement Scheme, did it, is because they were getting feedback from their customers that they were questioning the relevance of what they were getting out. So that was the issue. And they were potentially could lose customers, so they were interested in, obviously, in getting the genetic improvement schemes going robustly and well. So what traits to include? Should there be multiple indices? What should the trait weightings be? And how would this have any impact on the design of breeding programs or marketing programs for that matter? This is how it works in a preference-based system. This is taking straight out trade-offs here. Would you prefer to have 8 less lameness cases per 100 cows a year? Doesn't matter what they are, or 1 more lactation per cow? Because when cows fall out of the herd, they fall out partly because of lameness. That's it. And you choose one or the other. What this does iteratively is that it goes through and asks a whole lot of questions, and based on the answer to your previous questions, it will come back and select another question. But there's always a contrast of a trade-off. So it's a trade-off is the important point. This is obviously a very big survey. It's got 78 questions. A lot of them that we develop are around the 28 to 35 questions for a farmer. Here's another one. 1.5 kilograms of more protein per cow per year versus 1% less feed per cow. In this survey, what's been done here out of bioeconomic models, because these are relatively simple in a bioeconomic sense, to make them equivalent financially. You don't need to do this. We didn't do that in the pasture one. We don't. It's much better if you don't have to make them equivalent. You get much more power in your survey. This one's using it. The financials come out of the equivalence. They're much harder to, in my view, if you can avoid using them and use financial levels, they're more powerful. But sometimes you have to do it, depending on, otherwise your surveys get too complicated. This is the outcome, the relative preferences. You can see it goes, I don't know how many traits there, 3, 6, 13 traits, 40, so about 7%. So fundamentally, the average there is a bit, might have been more actually. There might be more traits in that model. So the average is about 7%, and you can see that mastitis, longevity, and fertility, and so the top, usually you find the top quarter of your traits are going to be significantly different from the expected mean, about that. So it enables you to do it, and then the bottom ones fall out for the same background. There's some just the rates. You can see the variances are quite large, and then what you try and do is see if any of your demographics or your groups then take those out. This is a different type of the grouping. This is grouping now into 3 types of traits. In dairy cattle, you've got the functional traits, which are things that really cause people to cull animals. Like they're mastitis, lameness, fertility. In production traits, milking, how long it takes to milk a cow, the production of milk, of protein, production of fat, the amount of feed an animal eats. And then the type traits are those that farmers regard as important or have come to have intuitions about are important for their performance. They might be things like udder placement, which is actually quite important in robotic milking, or in milking where you've got robotic, putting on cups robotically. So it gives you an idea of clustering. This clustering led to an outcome for the industry. This is DataGene's selection index results. So what we did here, I don't want you to take too much notice of what all the numbers are, but on the left was the original, what they started off with, a single index. They came and they now offer 3 different indexes. You'll see that the green was productivity, and their previous index was about 60%, and you'll see in all of the others productivity is now less. What's actually happened is that cell count, in other words, that's associated with mastitis, has increased in importance. And 1 or 2 other traits have as well, slightly increased in performance. But the important point is that it's led to 3 different indexes. And these are now marketed these are now marketed by the breeding companies. DataGene is the service company behind the whole thing. These now the companies have now 3 different indexes. So the animals are either the bulls, which the farmers buy semen for. You can either buy them on high ranking for balanced performance, or high ranking for a health weighted index, or a high weighted for a type based index. So it's changed the way the companies market their things. So what they do is they might be the same bull, but they'll have 3 different rankings for it in 3 different outcomes, 3 different applications. Make sense? Now going to give you an example of one that's got into the industry. Now going to give you an example of one which really has not been taken up in any obvious way by the industry, and that's in relation to breeding of pasture species. It was done, and Kevin Smith and I did it, and I think we published there's 2 papers, 2011 and 2014. What do we do here? Why? It's a complexity. Why do we do it? Why do they want us to do it? Because the complexity of defining relative values and traits for these highly competitive businesses, and their fundamental need is they're around growing the market, and they have a consortium to grow the market, but then they fight over market share. So they unite to grow the market, but they fight over market share. So they're trying to get a point of difference. Maybe part of the reason why the uptake is not overt. So there are monetary values for traits. What we're interested in is, can you derive monetary values for traits that are difficult to access financially? What would influence farmers' decisions? Why do they buy? Relative weightings to apply in selection, and applications in both breeding and marketing programs. Understanding more about the farmer, what they market, what they sell. This is what you call a willingness to pay approach. And here you work around a parameter that says, okay, how much am I prepared to pay? How much am I prepared to pay extra for this particular trait? Therefore, you need an anchor trait that can be valued economically. And there are some characteristics of getting this anchor trait right are very important. And this is what we've learned. So after a lot of difficulty, actually, a lot of going toing and froing, talking to a lot of people, Kevin and I came up with the value of pasture yield as being the anchor trait. And people said it was early spring, some people said it was this and this. Anyway, in the end, we did a survey across 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, in 3 environments: temperate, high rainfall, and Mediterranean environments. And we expressed it, and the anchor we used was something that, if we did this in Australia, that farmers are very used to doing. They compensate for lack of pasture by using grain. And grain's got a defined price. It's in the market. It's higher at the moment, but it's got a defined price in the market. So we were able to use that as the value to anchor. So then we went through, we did the survey, right? And this is the question. This was a 2 survey model. So we said, okay, and you'll see here it's a willingness to pay alternative option. So you've got no change in spring yield and increased autumn yield equivalent to 2 tonne of grain on that side. And the contra is increased spring yield equivalent to 1 change of grain, or increased autumn yield equivalent to 1 tonne of grain. So in other words, that's 2 tonne of grain in the autumn, that's 1 in each. Which do people prefer? And that's the power of the thing. So doing all that, we came up with some very interesting things, right? You can see it just going across the top. Spring, 25 cents the average. Spring is not important to anybody. The grass always grows in spring. Even in the Mediterranean climate, if you late rain, you're probably going to get rain, even if you didn't get it on our hemisphere. If you don't get it in April, May in the South Australia, you're likely to get it sometime in the winter. So spring is going to be reliable. The thing that's not reliable is autumn and winter, and less so in summer. So you can see that, right? The important point is that spring yield is less important than other seasons, and summer yield is relatively more important in the high rainfall zone than in the Mediterranean zone, because in the Mediterranean zone they take their animals off. They don't have them there in the autumn, in the summer. In autumn, when they've got their animals, it's mating time. They want to have really good yields. They want autumn to be reliable. So that gives you an idea. The logic is there, but we're able to quantify the logic. What do we do? In the end, because we actually chose autumn yield. This is an example of autumn yield. And fundamentally, we check for linearity. And we check for linearity within individual responses. This is the means, but we check for linearity within the individual responses. So we do a covariate model just to check the linearity of response. In other words, is 1, 2, and 3 ton of grain, is 3 ton of grain worth basically 3 times as much? Then you can come up with some numbers and say, for argument's sake, the preference value of per $100 of grain is 3.4%. In other words, that's in the complete survey, it's about 3.4%. The mean percentage preference value for a ton of grain was 8.6%. So we were able to work this out in the next stage of the survey. And then you can say, okay, what's the dollar value per 1% preference per year? And it came out to $29 fundamentally. And over the 3 environments, that was much the same, which is why we in fact chose autumn yield, because it's actually much the same. That's really important that we were able to use the same parameter across all 3. And we were able to use the same parameter across all 3 and across all 4 species. So that's the value of yield. So we used autumn yield as the financial benchmark, as the anchor trait. It enables us to quantify the value of other traits against autumn yield. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Persistence, which is a straight out, persistence is regarded by farmers buying to replace perennial pastures as a critical factor. So we put in there 2, 4, or no change in persistence, an extra 2 years before you have to resow, 4 years or 6 years. So that's a really critical factor for these guys. And then we looked at 2 other traits: survival under adverse conditions, which is actually around aluminium, waterlogging, and those sorts of things, particularly important in lucid alfalfa, particularly important in alfalfa. And then summer survival, which is particularly important with perennial ryegrasses in the temperate region, because with the increasing temperatures, you get more days over 25 to 27 degrees where perennial ryegrass starts to suffer. So particularly important. I'm just going to give you, take a bit of thinking about, so I don't want to take too much time on them. So there's no change, so what we've got here, no change in autumn yield or increased autumn yield per hectare equivalent to 500 tonnes of grain. Now, very subtly, we had to check to get the consistency here. We had to go from 2 tonne of grain to the monetary value, but we told them at the start what we were using. But we had to put it into quantitative, even though in the previous survey we've done it in tonnes to get the equilibration across the seasons and the environments. Here we had to put it into dollars to make it real. So it was important. And then pasture is more persistent now and lasts 2 years longer than now, or pasture lasts the same time as now. So you can see a pair of questions and a pair of questions. People get quite fast at answering these. They say, oh, hell, I absolutely need more persistence, no matter what it costs. Right? That's what they do. Or they might say, no. They might think more and they say, I need autumn kills me. I need more in autumn. So, but they get quite fast at answering them. And then this is another trade-off. This is actually pasture. This was a straight out yes or no one, really. Pasture always survives in adverse conditions. Salt, waterlogging, and high aluminium, no doubt. Yeah, high aluminium. And that's another straight out comparison. And this is a persistence. So this is survival in a hot, dry summer, which, as I mentioned, is really important for ryegrass. Oh, sorry. Doesn't like going back, this machine. So what do we find? Found that you can see along the top, as I said before, the autumn yield per 1% preference per year is about the same number. The value of an extra year of persistence, we convert this to financial values, and you can see an extra year of persistence is not only worth half as much in a Mediterranean environment as it's worth in a high rainfall environment. Because people, they actually don't tend to sow that often. So persistent, they rely on annuals, and the annuals self-seed. So it's not a terribly surprising thing because they've got a lot of annual species. The real thing with these guys is when they want to introduce a new species, that's a very big decision. And they'll often introduce a different species rather than improve cultivar of the same one. And then the value of guaranteed survival. You'll see in the temperate situation with ryegrass, the value of guaranteed survival under, in particular, this relates to salt actually, and salt is actually worth a lot more for ryegrass. And then if you get into survival in hot, dry summers, again, you'll see that that guaranteed survival in hot, dry summers, despite what we thought that this would be a really important thing for people in the temperate areas where you've got a lot of where there's quite a lot of ryegrass. We thought it would be really important. It's not as important. I think we did this survey again now after 3 years in southern Victoria of very high summer temperatures and ryegrass dying. I think we would well see a very different thing. So it's very interesting as to what actually happens. And so you can put all these into context. I'll just do this one here. The guaranteed survival in adverse conditions of 306 is equivalent to 1.2 tons of grain in a temperate environment, or 2.1 tons of grain in a high rainfall environment. So you can get how to use it. So the principles that we go through here, that priorities can evolve over time, and I think that survival in hot, dry summers will be one of them. But it gives an opportunity to engage with farmers and other users, such as buyers, to understand their wants and needs. It ensures that breeding program priorities align with user needs. So it's a way of talking about why you've done something. It's actually I would say a lot of this is about a marketing tool for people, for the companies. And it builds, and it can also help influence how people communicate their message to their users. And it aims to build product profiles and selection tools to help boost adoption, which is the same thing, which is the rationale behind the work with next-gen cassava. So, what are next-gen cassava? Where does it fit? As I said, the top three are just the same. Who? Farmers, women in the family, buyers in the market, the sellers of cassava stem cuttings. They are the people that might influence. So in summary, what I've given you a wee bit about Abacus, about why we've done survey-based methods, where we've got to, bearing in mind we've been involved in this now for just over 10 years and we've learned a lot, and we still aren't there, but we've learned a lot. Why engage with users, a little bit about the approach and how we've integrated demographic surveys, which are very important actually, and then a couple of applications and where it goes to with next-gen cassava. Okay.
Thanks. That was interesting. Any questions?
Yeah, so like finding your target market is something.
Yeah.
And better marketing probably towards the we also have this increased logistical cost to marketing these suburbs and all of us. And we have sort of a general intuition on how we love to gain it. It probably depends on how much you say.
It is, yeah.
Any intuition on how much?
In a sense that if I look at for example, take the seed companies in New Zealand, you're always marketing to dairy farmers versus hill country guys versus, those are the two big clusters, right? And so fundamentally, you've almost got a different, you may have your type of ryegrass you might offer to one may be subtly different. For example, a late flowering ryegrass is probably worth a lot more to a hill country sheep and beef farmer than it is to a dairy farmer who can manage pastures by grazing control. So it really comes down, you might have the same product, you might have the same actually set of ryegrasses, but you might market them differently. I think it's a horses for courses, to be honest. It's an important question, but I don't know if there's any blanket answer. It's just, but you don't need to, the things aren't that precise. They're helps, not, yeah.
You mentioned that people get pretty fast at answering these survey questions. Do you use response time as a way to make decisions, right? So like those ones that take a lot longer.
Yeah, we get rid of them. I'll tell you what we do. Yeah, what we do, this is why I emphasize that early stage thing, right? We spend a huge amount of time getting the questions right. And we've had three workshops, for example, on the honeybee one to date that I can think of. 3 workshops with different people going through, the question's too complicated. Cut out 7 words, or, so we fundamentally, and then we test it again and test it again. Because you mess up when you do 1,000 minds, it comes up with an estimate of the number of questions and the amount of time. at the bottom. It gives you, it does a model, it does a prediction. So it's actually very powerful. Like, and it depends a lot on who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with specialists, you can have a lot more questions and you can go for 20 minutes. If you're dealing with farmers or something like that, you might want it down to 8 to 10 or 25 questions, or I can't remember, but 18, I think 18 is a really quite good number for, and you can't do too many levels. So you've got to be really careful about the subtleties there. The levels are the power you put into the model to actually get the financials. You have to get levels into financials. That's where the linearity issue comes in.
To what extent do you test your models when you're essentially developing your models by surveying them?
Yeah, totally.
To what extent do you test them by you potentially for research time?
Wow, that's yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Well, that's actually one of the things that I'm not sure what's going to come out of it. We're having discussions with ICBF over the Irish sheep one. As to how effectively that's about adoption, though. It's more about, are they taking notice of the index versus not taking notice of it, which is a key thing, right? And of course the Irish they're the post really cunning on how they've introduced incentives into uptake of genetics in Ireland. They've used EU subsidies to do that. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating case study in its own right. So it may not be the best market. I think that the Australian, when we come to it, after about, I think the Australians have had 2 years now of selling this way. I think when we come to do an analysis to see what actually, whether the proportion, whether they got increased uptake, would be probably the best one. And in the next year in Cassava one, we've had discussions about, do we take the survey and there's an individual level, because we won't have time to influence the breeding program inside a Reti's PhD, do we actually now go out and see what people are actually buying? So that's one of the parts of the Reti. I'm not sure where it's got to, but I haven't talked to a Reti for 2 months because she's been away. But that's what we're thinking there, is we go out and see what they're actually buying. And see if it's more influenced, for example, by the guy selling the cuttings. Yeah. But there's one of the things that Thousand Minds tries to do is to keep on asking the question. If you get pesky and it's not giving you clean answers, it keeps on going back. Willingness to pay is fraught. It's totally fraught, as you know. Yeah. But it's better than not knowing. That's the best description. Certainly the farmers in the one with the Johne's disease, they liked the idea that they and the vets, they understood that this was much bigger than the economic thing. But having something they could say, actually, we like that. It actually means something to us was important. It's a very important question. I don't know the answer.
So, the selection.
Sorry, I can't hear so well. So.
I will try to talk louder. The selection. So, if you had 2 breeding companies with different genotype stock, would you offer them the same index, or could you change your index?
No, you'd go and you'd work with if they came to us, we would say we'd do a survey of your customers. We'd work with their client base.
But what about the genetic, like they have a population that they are breeding, and it's their current breeding population.
Yep.
And another company, which is a different population, I think the index does not take into consideration the genetic potential.
Yeah, I think that's about what they, we've got one, for example, in ryegrass, we've got one who's quite big on recurrent selection, and the other one who's is very big on bringing in different ecotypes. And they've got 2 quite contrasting strategies. But equally, if you go and examine the genetics of their cultivars, you'll find they've used each other's stuff in their own background. So, but generally, what we work with the individual, the group, the customer defines whether we would normally go to their own customers, to their group, and ask the question.
So to follow this, suppose I have, like I'm going to change it to a different question. I have 2 children, one of them is good in arts and the other one is going to be quantitative, because his brain is do I push them in the same direction and say you're going to be engineers, or do I push them in a different direction?
Yeah, let them go. Well, I can only talk about our kids. We just let them do what they like. I'm not sure. I think it's been moderately successful. question. Sorry.
So have you ever encountered what we in the Midwest call non-negotiable traits?
Oh yeah, threshold traits, rust.
Yeah,
Rust and ryegrass. Just forget it. Yeah, rust. So the breeders just there's no rust question. And I doubt there's maybe there was a rust question initially, but it's irrelevant because it's just a culling trait. Full stop, culling trait. Another one's establishment, which is a big issue in ryegrass. I mean, you're totally intolerant of anything doesn't establish. In tall fescue, you've got to take time. So tall fescue, for example, establishment in ryegrass has no real economic value because everything is good. In tall fescue, it's got huge economic value because it's not all good. And so yes, absolutely. So we just call them threshold traits and they go out. That's why we were really interested in this absolute survival. Those absolute survival ones, that hot, dry environment one and the adverse environment were designed to see if there were threshold traits we were missing. Yeah, so that's why they don't really go in the breeding objective. They end up as they just rogue. It's a roguing model. Yeah.
Any other questions? Otherwise,
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.